Eric DeCosta did an interview with Todd McShay that was released today where he revealed some behind-the-scenes untold information about the Lamar Jackson decision to draft him in 2018 and how he was the one pushing Ozzie and kind of driving that train.
I learned from the Joe Flacco trade. We had the 8th pick. We went back to 26 and we went back up to 22. We got Flacco. That if you assess league value, you can go back and still get your quarterback.
Right.
And so the idea was we were going to do the same thing with Lamar as we did with Joe. So we went, Howie was willing to trade. We went back. We ended up drafting Hayden Hurst because we went back and we went back again. We ended up getting some 2/3 and a 4th as well. But Howie was willing to trade out of 32 and take our second and give us 32. So we ended up drafting Hayden Hurst at 25. Kevin Byrne, our PR guy, wanted us to go downstairs to the press conference. Kevin, let's just hold off. The scouts and coaches, they thought we were done. They thought we were done.
Done for the night, yeah.
So Ozzie would always sit at the head of the table, still does. I sit to his right. Steve Bisciotti's across the way, talking to John. They're high-fiving, they're happy, whatever. I looked at Ozzie and I go, let's call Howie. And he said, you want to? I said, yeah, let's call him. So I call Howie. Howie says, I want to do it. So I looked at Ozzie. I said, get Lamar on the phone. Ozzie called Lamar. I'm on the phone with Howie. We did the trade. We turned it in. No one even knew in the room that we were doing it. No one was paying attention.
That's wild.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden I go, hey guys, we just got Lamar Jackson. And the room just went crazy.
That's awesome.
That's awesome. Yeah.
What a story.
This was a story that I have not heard before, and most people credit Ozzie Newsome for going out with a bang in his last year as GM, getting Lamar Jackson and Orlando Brown and Mark Andrews. We ended up trading Orlando Brown, but he still held his value. That was a great draft that Ozzie went out with, especially getting a Lamar Jackson. I mean, it changed our franchise forever, really. And I know it was a pass the baton year. I knew Eric knew he was going to be the GM. This wasn't, out of nowhere that Ozzie was stepping down. So it makes sense that Eric's very involved. I mean, Eric's been under Ozzie and working with Ozzie for 2 decades. So I'm not surprised that Eric was involved, but I guess I was surprised that he is convincing Ozzie, like, hey, let's do this trade. I got Howie on the phone. The deal's done. Let's get back in there and get Lamar. Ozzie, you get Lamar on the phone. Eric's the one moving all the pieces and getting the trade done and putting the work in to make this happen and kind of really make this decision. And it sounds like it was a pretty private decision. I suggest you listen to the whole interview. I got the link in the description. It's a great 30-minute interview with a lot more detail. But Eric talked about how he loved that Lamar didn't have an agent because the Ravens are as private gets. Eric reiterated in that if publicly there's a player connected to the Baltimore Ravens, it's almost 100% false because nothing they do gets out, really. And they had been meeting with Lamar in the pre-draft process, but since he didn't have an agent, nothing ever got leaked. And Eric said that a reporter called him and was like, hey, I kind of heard that Lamar interviewed with you guys. And Eric's just like, no, prove it.
Lamar did not have an agent. And it was, we wanted to bring him into Baltimore. We're very secretive in Baltimore. We don't want to be connected to players. You'll never really, if you see us connected to a player, that probably means we're not connected to that
Right.
player.
We've learned.
So I don't ever want to be connected to anybody. So the challenge was, how do we get Lamar Jackson to come visit us in Baltimore? We didn't bring any other quarterbacks in that year. We did like some quarterbacks. We figured they wouldn't be there when we picked.
Right.
So we felt like Lamar might be the one guy that had a chance to be there in the 20s when we picked. One of my jobs as a scouting director at that time was to assess league value. How do other teams feel about these players? That's a big part of my job, still is. And I felt like Lamar would be there in the 20s, maybe in the 30s, but definitely in the 20s. And so how do we get him? We brought him into Baltimore. The nice thing about a player that doesn't have an agent, there's no leaks.
Yeah.
Right? No one knew that Lamar Jackson spent a day and a half with us in Baltimore. I got one call from somebody in the media. They said, I heard Lamar Jackson might have visited you guys. I said, no. Can you prove it? Like, why do you say that?
Yeah.
He goes, well, I just kind of caught rumblings of it. I said, well, if you want to report it, you can, but you might be wrong. I'm not going to say one way or the other.
This was one of the franchise's best draft picks of all time, especially to trade back into the first round at 32 and get Lamar Jackson, who was the 5th quarterback taken in that draft. The only one you could even argue, I guess, is Josh Allen that was drafted ahead of him. But, Baker Mayfield, Sam Darnold, Josh Rosen and Josh Allen all went ahead of Lamar Jackson. And Ozzie Newsome still deserves a ton of credit. I'm not trying to like strip the credit from him, and I don't think that's what Eric DeCosta is doing either. But it does show you how much of a collaborative effort this was. And in this particular case with Lamar Jackson, it seems like Eric DeCosta was the one pulling all of the strings to make this happen. And Ozzie just kind of gave the approval. So in Ozzie's last draft, it was a lot of Eric DeCosta. So I need to give Eric DeCosta a ton of credit for drafting Lamar Jackson. There's a ton of good stuff in this interview. It's only a 30-minute interview. I highly suggest you just watch the whole thing. But another thing that stood out to me that Eric DeCosta was asked about was, how do you support a superstar like Lamar Jackson with roster? You know, what do you prioritize putting around him? How do you strategize building this team? And Eric DeCosta talked about, strong offensive line. We already had a strong tight end room, keeping a lot of depth at running back because we're going to run the ball. He's like, we had all those things. He's like, we wanted to add speed, Hollywood, Zay Flowers. But Eric DeCosta did admit that he has messed up and has been unable to find a true X receiver.
We've always had multiple backs,
yeah,
that we can rotate and guys will be productive. And always try to add speed to the field. We feel like Lamar, being the type of player he is, he presents so many challenges for linebackers in the front. Getting guys outside. So we drafted Hollywood, we drafted Zay, we drafted Bate. We've allocated a lot of resources. We don't have that. The one piece we probably have missed on is that big X presence. We've never really had that. We've tried to find that guy. That guy doesn't go on trees, right?
Yeah.
They're hard to find those kind of guys, right? That's probably the one thing.
I thought this was interesting to hear because it sounds like he's still wanting that. And us fans have been calling for that as well for a long time. And he explained how hard it is to get one of those guys. He's like, they don't grow on trees. And I admit that we haven't done a good enough job of getting that true X receiver, that go-to jump ball, big body guy that Lamar can throw to when covered. And I know they were trying to add speed, but you could go back to Eric DeCosta's first draft when he drafted Hollywood. And I do love Hollywood. I'm not saying that Hollywood's a bad player. But right after Hollywood in that draft go DK Metcalf, A.J. Brown. You could have got your X right there. But I get the connection with Lamar and Hollywood. Both South Florida guys knew each other when they were younger. Hollywood did bring speed to the offense, which they were also trying to add. So I understand. I'm not saying Hollywood's like an awful pick, but that X receiver was in that draft, and went later in that draft. So it's been there, but yeah, it hasn't worked out. And I think the Ravens are still looking for that. It didn't sound like Eric DeCosta was done. He's like, we still need that X, but we've done a good job adding running backs. We got a strong tight end room. We're beefing up the offensive line. We got speed at receiver. We still need that true X. Great interview overall. Shout out to Todd McShay for getting that done. Go watch the full thing. It was nice to hear more detail from Eric DeCosta. We don't hear from him a ton, and we're not going to hear from him or Harbaugh or anyone else really from the Ravens for a while unless something randomly comes up, or when they sign a free agent, they might have a press conference or the owners' meetings months from now. But there's not, you don't get a lot of insight. You're not going to hear from these guys too often. So it was nice to get a little bit more of a peek behind the scenes, and I feel like Eric DeCosta did do that, especially with that Lamar Jackson draft story. I didn't know that he was the one pulling all the strings in that situation. That was definitely new information to me. But let me know what you're thinking about everything. I appreciate you guys, as always, for tuning in to another episode of the Flock Rundown, and I'll let the greatest linebacker in the history of the game take us out.
Ravens Flock. The Flock Rundown is the place to be. My man Ryan has been a lifelong Ravens fan since he was born. The Flock Rundown. Nothing gets better than waking up and wondering how high we can fly. Tune in.
Motionless brainwaves attempt to swim their way to sense, can't tame the untamed.